Moonlight lies on a slow, black river. Not a bright, glittering kind of light, but the pale kind that seems to soften everything it touches. It turns the moving water into a sheet of shadow. It silvers the edges of reeds. It catches on small ripples where the current changes its mind and then it lets them go again. Somewhere out in the darkness, two broad currents meet. They do not crash. They do not shout. They simply fold into one another with a patient, steady agreement, as if they have been doing this forever, and as if they will keep doing it long after any listener has fallen asleep. Along the bank, reeds whisper in the night wind. It is easy, almost too easy, to imagine that they remember, that they have heard the same footfalls, the same murmured prayers, the same quiet arguments, over and over through ages no one counted at the time. This is the land that later ages would call Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, and as a plain fact it becomes one of the earliest places where cities, writing and organised states take root, especially in the southern lowlands that we call Sumer. But the story does not begin as a neat line on a page. It begins the way this river moves, slowly, silently, sometimes shifting its course in ways that only become obvious after many seasons. What we know of Sumer, what we can say with confidence, comes mostly from what the earth kept. Mud brick walls that melted back into soil, foundations buried under newer foundations, streets erased by floods and rebuilt a little higher. A landscape that never stayed perfectly still, because the rivers themselves wandered, cutting new channels and abandoning old ones like thoughts drifting in sleep. And then there are the tablets. Thousands upon thousands of them, small palm-sized pieces of clay, once wet and pliable, now hardened into quiet survival. They are not dramatic at first. Many are not poems or prayers. Many are lists, deliveries, tallies, names, small marks that once meant something practical to someone who had to get through a day. This is how the earlier Sumerian story is pieced together. From ruins that used to be homes, from river-shifted ground that once held fields, from storerooms that collapsed and sealed their contents, and from clay that, almost by accident, became time-proof. And even the name we use, Sumerians, has a softness to it when you look closely. Some historians and scholars suggest that Sumerians may not have been one single, fixed people in the way later nations imagine themselves. It may have been a long-blended population, shaped by movement and marriage and labour, sharing cities and temples and an evolving language, until that shared life became something recognisable. So the river is not only water, it is a hint of how identities form, current meeting current, until a single flow emerges, and only later does someone name it. Our timeline too is not perfectly clean. As a matter of fact, it is mostly reconstructed from archaeology and from later documents like king lists, records that try to arrange the past into a sequence of rulers and reigns. In some stretches the picture sharpens, in others it blurs. There are years that feel solid underfoot, and then there are gaps where we step carefully, guided by fragments and careful comparison. Still, at night the city gate is real. Imagine a watchman there, an ordinary man not carved into stone, not crowned with a title. He stands where the wall opens, where darkness outside becomes the guarded darkness within. He listens for footsteps, because footsteps are information. They could be traders arriving late, leading donkeys heavy with goods. They could be thieves testing the edge of the city's attention. They could be a messenger from another city, carrying news that will change tomorrow's mood. The watchman does not know he is standing in one of the earliest regions where the idea of the city is taking shape. He does not know that the words for this place will travel farther than his own voice ever could. He is simply listening. He's simply keeping the line between inside and outside intact for another night. And beneath all of it, beneath the gate, beneath the packed earth, beneath layers that will someday be called archaeological strata. Time is building itself like a slow wall. In those layers, long before anyone writes a story the way we think of stories, there are small objects that speak in a different language, clay accounting tokens, and sealed clay envelopes, bully, pressed shut and stamped, carrying within them the count of grain or animals or labour owed. They are facts of administration, yes, but they are also early evidence of a mind trying to hold the world steady, trying to make obligation visible, trying to make memory countable. It is tempting to wonder, just briefly, whether the first great invention here was not the city or the temple or the king, but the decision that life could be tracked, that a day could be captured, that trust could be stored in clay. The river keeps moving, the reeds keep whispering, the watchman keeps listening, and somewhere between mud and memory something begins. If a city is made of mud and memory, what does it take for it to last long enough to be remembered? If you want more stories like this, quiet cinematic history, you can subscribe and drop a comment. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? I love reading those, especially at night. Dawn arrives quietly in the marsh. Before the sun has fully lifted itself above the flat horizon, the world is mostly grey. Fog rests low over the waterlogged ground, soft as cloth. Bird calls travel across the reeds in long, patient notes, and then fade into the distance as if the air itself is still half asleep. Somewhere in that pale light, a reed boat moves. You can hear it before you see it. The soft knock of a pole touching the muddy bottom. Small sound, steady and unhurried. Push, drift, push again. The boat slides through narrow channels where water and land have not yet decided which one will win. This southern edge of Mesopotamia, the later heartland of Sumer, is not a place that offers easy certainty. It is an alluvial plain, built from river silt, always shifting. The ground can be generous one season and stubborn the next. Water can be a blessing, and then, without warning, too much of it can become its own kind of trouble. And yet, in the long stretch we call the Ubaid period, this plain begins to hold more and more people. In the archaeological record, you can see the change in small, ordinary traces. More hearths, more refuse pits, more repaired floors. The quiet evidence of people staying, season after season, long enough for a place to start feeling like home. With that rootedness comes a different kind of attention. Not the attention of kings or armies, but the attention of neighbours. The kind that wakes early and checks the water before anything else. Clearing reeds from a channel. Watching the way the flow behaves after a night of wind. Learning, slowly, stubbornly, how to guide water into fields and keep it moving where it needs to go. It isn't one invention with one inventor. It's a long habit shaped by many hands, many seasons, and many small adjustments made at the edge of a canal. And as these communities grow, something else begins to take shape. Something that is not only practical, temples, not the towering stepped, monuments people often picture when they hear the word, but early sacred spaces, built up, rebuilt, and built again. Platforms that lift a place above damp earth, a point of focus in a landscape where the horizon offers few natural landmarks. Over time, these spaces begin to anchor collective labour. They become places where work gathers and is organised, where storage is managed, where redistribution happens, grain and goods moving in and out, not only as private property, but as shared survival. Ritual is there too, shaping the rhythm of days and seasons, giving structure to hopes and fears that are difficult to speak aloud. Some historians suggest, carefully because the evidence is partial, that the temple's role may have been economic as much as spiritual. not in a cold modern sense of economy, but in the older sense, the management of a household extended to the scale of a community, a place where surplus is handled, where obligations are recognised, where certain people are fed because their labour is needed elsewhere. It is a quiet kind of power, not always visible on the surface, but felt in the way people move, bringing offerings, receiving rations, following schedules that belong to something beyond the individual home. And even here in this marsh-bound world, there are hints of distances beyond the reeds. Traces of materials appear that the southern plain cannot easily provide. Stone, timber, metals, sometimes a dark, glassy obsidian that comes from far away. Their presence suggests exchange networks reaching outward into uplands and distant valleys, into places where the earth offers different gifts. It does not require imagining grand caravans the way later ages would. It can begin with small, slow exchanges, a traveller bringing something rare, a boatload of goods moving along a river, a chain of trades, one village to the next, until a material has travelled farther than any one person. Even in the earliest chapters of this story, the South is not isolated. It is already connected, already part of a wider world that meets it at the edges, the way two currents meet in the dark and quietly change each other's course. Now, bring your attention back down, close to the water. There is a reed worker. It is not a grand title, but it is a vital one. In a land that is waterlogged and shifting, reeds are not just background. They are resource, shelter, tool, and lifeline. The reed worker sits where the ground is firm enough to hold weight without swallowing it. Their hands move with practiced ease, fingers stained with river mud, the sharp, clean scent of cut reed rising as bundles are split and sorted. Small pricks on the skin, nothing dramatic, just the quiet cost of making something useful. They braid reeds into mats, tight, even weaving that can become a wall, a floor, a windbreak. They shape boat panels, binding bundles together so they float true and strong. They know which reeds bend without snapping, which ones last longer in sun, which ones need drying before they can be trusted. Skills like this are as valuable as grain, because grain cannot travel without containers, cannot be stored without roofs, cannot be brought across water without boats. And so a life is built from simple, repeated acts. Gathering reeds, cutting them clean, laying them out, weaving, binding, repairing. Listening, without thinking about it, to the sound of water moving in the channels nearby. A slow craft for a slow landscape. In that same world, pottery dries in the sun. Ubaid-style painted pottery, simple bowls and jars often decorated with dark, careful patterns, appears across many sites. These vessels are one of the ways archaeologists trace shared habits across communities. They are evidence not only of function, but of taste and teaching. Someone chose to paint a line a certain way. Someone knew what good pottery looked like, and another person learned that standard by watching, and trying, and failing, and trying again. And at places like Eridu, one of the key early sites in the southern plain, temple platforms rise and rise again through multiple building phases. Layer by layer, the rebuilding suggests continuity, a sacred place maintained over generations, each new platform laid over the memory of the last. In a landscape where floodwater can erase last year's footprints, this kind of rebuilding matters. It is a decision to return, to place the next layer where the old one stood, to say, in mud and labour, this is where we gather. This is where the world is centred for us. There is no need here for loud declarations. The declaration is the work itself. The fog lifts, the birds scatter and return. The reed boat glides back toward shore, pole tapping softly as steady as breathing. And somewhere in the middle of all these ordinary motions, irrigation channels, woven mats, painted pots, and raised platforms. Something is happening that later ages will recognize as the beginning of a different kind of life. Not yet the full city, not yet the monumental state, but a community learning how to build a shared center, a place that asks for labor and gives structure in return, a place where people begin to imagine themselves as part of something enduring. And as the first sacred platforms rise above the marsh, it leaves a gentle question hanging in the morning air, quiet as fog, but persistent. When a community builds its first sacred platform, are they reaching for the gods or for each other? And if it began there, above the marsh, then the next steps would be made in clay, in counting, and in names that refuse to fade. Torchlight flickers on a wall of mud bricks so thick it feels like a landscape of its own. The bricks hold the day's warmth a little longer than the open air. In the night you can smell smoke and damp earth, and underneath that, something softer, familiar, almost sweet. Barley beer, warm and yeasty, drifting out from courtyards and doorways where people are still awake. Footsteps echo in a wide courtyard. Not the single set of feet you would hear in a small settlement, where everyone knows the sound of everyone else. These are many footsteps, overlapping, passing, fading, returning. Somewhere a dog barks, somewhere a door closes and a voice answers in low tones, swallowed quickly by the night. We have moved forward in time into what archaeologists call the Uruk period, and the scale of life changes here in a way that is difficult to describe without sounding like exaggeration. Settlements swell. The old river towns thicken into something denser, and Uruk, one particular city in the southern plain, begins to look like one of the world's first true cities on a massive scale. We reach for modern words and they still feel too small. But if you stand in the torchlight beside those walls, you begin to understand why historians need language that simply means bigger than what came before. Because a city is not just many houses clustered together. A city is a new kind of rhythm, a new kind of distance between people's lives, a new way of organizing the day, where you can walk for a long time and still be inside the same human-made world. Inside Uruk, the horizon is no longer only reeds and water and open sky. It is walls, it is courtyards, it is streets packed hard by countless feet. It is a skyline shaped by elevated precincts and rising platforms, built spaces that declare themselves even in the dark. Monumental architecture expands here. Temple precincts grow larger and more complex. Administrative buildings appear in the record alongside sacred ones. There are spaces that feel designed not only for ritual but for management. Rooms and halls where goods move, where decisions are made, where the city keeps track of itself. And all of this rests on the old foundation that never truly disappears. Water. Irrigation agriculture intensifies. Canals and ditches become more than local projects. They become systems. The fields beyond the walls matter as much as anything inside them, because the city must be fed, and feeding a city requires more than good harvests. It requires predictability, maintenance, coordination, and labor. Not only at planting and harvest, but day after day, keeping water moving where it should. When we say the city grows, we're also saying more hands are needed. With that, specialized labor becomes more visible. In the archaeological record, crafts and workshops stand out more clearly than before. Bureaucracy, still in early forms, shows itself in tools and impressions. Organized workforces begin to appear in the pattern of things, suggesting coordinated building projects and the management of large groups of workers. In a village, a craftsperson might also be a farmer. In a city, a craftsperson can become simply that. Someone whose days are spent shaping clay, weaving textiles, grinding grain, brewing beer, making tools, hauling bricks, carrying water. Names vanish. Work remains. Now imagine one worker among many, a brewer. Not a figure in a grand relief, not a hero in a later tale, but someone whose hands know the weight of grain and the behaviour of water. In a courtyard that smells of fermentation, the brewer measures by habit and by eye. A scoop of grain, the right amount of water, the warmth of the air, the time needed before the mixture becomes what it should. In this world, beer is not simply indulgence, it is nourishment. It is part of rations. It is a way to turn grain into something that keeps, something that can be shared in measured portions, something that feels both ordinary and comforting after long hours of labour. The brewer works steadily because workers will come, the brickmakers, the haulers, the builders shaping precinct walls that will outlast their names. If the brewer's mixture is wrong, if it sours, if it fails, it is not just a small mistake. It becomes a break in the city's rhythm. The brewer may not think of their work as part of the birth of a new human form called urban life. They may only think, people will be hungry, and this is what I can provide. And yet, this is how the city becomes real. Not only through walls and temples, but through countless repeated tasks that fit together like bricks. Uruk is not only a place, it becomes an idea. And something else happens during this period, something larger than the city's own boundaries. Archaeologists see traces of what is often called Uruk expansion, Uruk-style materials and influences appearing beyond the southern alluvial plain, in other regions. We do have evidence of Uruk connection stretching outward, but how this happened is still debated. Some historians suggest trade outposts, settlements tied to exchange and access to resources. Others suggest cultural influence spreading through imitation and contact. Others consider mixed migration, people moving, intermarrying, carrying practices and styles with them. The exact mechanism is uncertain, and it matters that we admit that uncertainty, because the past does not always leave us a clear explanation. Sometimes it leaves only patterns, seals, ceramics, building styles, like a shadow on the ground that tells you something passed this way, even if you cannot say exactly how. And still, one quiet problem follows the city everywhere it reaches. How do you make strangers trust one another? And seals. Yes, in the temple precincts at Uruk, especially in areas like the Enheduanna district, archaeologists have found seal impressions and administrative artifacts that speak in quiet detail about a world becoming more organized. Seals function like signatures, marks of authority, ways of saying, "This container was closed under my watch. This delivery belongs to this household. This storehouse is accounted for." To press a seal into clay is to make a relationship visible. It is to bind trust to a mark. It is to create a tiny, durable moment of administration, one that can outlast the person who pressed it. And as you walk through Uruk in your imagination, torchlight wavering on brick, you begin to sense how many lives must cross without knowing each other. How many households must exist side by side? How many hands must reach for water, for bread, for work, for sleep? The city is a chorus, but not everyone hears the whole song. Somewhere the brewer lifts a jar, checks the smell, listens to the faint fizz of living fermentation. Somewhere a worker leans against a wall, drinking slowly, feeling the day's weight loosen just enough to step into tomorrow. The night air holds barley sweetness and smoke. Footsteps continue, echoing and fading. The walls stand broad and heavy, holding all these lives inside their long shadow. And a question rises, not loudly, not like a challenge, but like a thought that returns when the mind is half asleep. What does it feel like to live inside the first place that truly deserves the name city? The room is small and cool and dim. Outside, the city breathes, footsteps on packed earth, distant voices, the soft groan of doors opening and closing. But in here, the air is quieter. It smells faintly of clay dust. The walls hold a little chill, and the light that enters is filtered, gentle, as if the room was built to keep the world from rushing in. Someone sits on the floor with a lump of wet clay. They pat it flat with the heel of the hand. Not too thin, not too thick. A shape that can be held, that can be moved, that can dry without cracking too quickly. The surface is smoothed with care, because marks on rough clay become uncertain marks, and uncertainty is exactly what this room is trying to avoid. Then a reed stylus touches the tablet. One press, a small wedge, another press, a line, a careful cluster of impressions that, at a glance, looks like nothing more than texture. But the hand making the marks knows they are not decoration. They are not art. They are a kind of holding. In practice, writing emerges here from accounting. Before it becomes poetry, before it becomes myth, before it becomes the long, aching laments of later centuries, it begins with grain and labour and herds and deliveries. Signs and numbers track what came in, what went out, who received what, and what is still owed. The first writing is, in a way, a memory that cannot be argued with. A basket of barley can be eaten. A herd can wander. A worker can insist they were promised more than they received. But a tablet, once dried, holds a claim with a stubborn quiet. It says, this is the count. This is the measure. This is what the institution believes is true. In the Uruk world, as administration grows heavier and more complex, tablets multiply. They become part of the architecture of power, even though they are small enough to fit in a hand. At first, the signs are pictographic, simple pictures, simplified enough to be pressed quickly. A sign that resembles a jar, a sign that resembles grain, a sign that points to an animal, a person, a unit of labour. Over time, those pictographic signs begin to thin and sharpen. The pressure of speed and repetition changes them. When a sign is made again and again, it becomes less like a picture and more like a reliable gesture. The hand learns what matters, not resemblance, but consistency, not beauty, but clarity. And once a mark stops being a picture, something else begins. Because now it can carry ideas no eye has ever seen. The marks become more stylized, more efficient, more suited to the reed stylus and the soft clay. Some historians suggest, carefully, that writing did not begin in one single moment. It did not arrive like lightning in one person's mind. Rather, it likely crystallized from multiple counting traditions, tokens, tallies, seals, and the habits of administration that were already shaping how people thought about goods and obligations. Writing may have been less a single invention than a convergence, small practices of order slowly gathering into one system. And once it becomes a system, it can be learned, it can be taught, it can be used in more than one place, it can travel from one city to another, carried by trained hands. In the small, cool room there is an apprentice, young perhaps, though age is not certain in the record. New to the discipline, certainly. Their hands are not yet fully confident. They hold the reed stylus too tightly at first, the way people do when they're afraid of making mistakes. The wrist stiffens, the fingers cramp, but they keep going. An apprentice scribe learns by repetition, not by inspiration, not by sudden insight, by copying the same signs again and again until the hand can produce them without hesitation. The apprentice's eyes are fixed on the tablet because a single wrong mark can change a tally. A wedge pressed too deeply, a line angled slightly wrong, a space placed where it doesn't belong. These can turn one measure into another, one amount owed into a different amount owed. And in a world where rations mean survival, error is not an abstract concept. It is hunger, it is accusation, it is punishment. So the apprentice breathes slowly and presses each mark with care. Nearby, an older scribe watches without speaking much. A small correction, a tap of the stylus against the edge of the tablet. Along one wall, finished tablets dry in neat rows, damp at the edges, already turning pale where the air touches them first. The apprentice glances at them sometimes, feeling the weight of what this skill can become. Because in time, cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script that will grow out of these early impressions, becomes flexible enough for more than accounting. It begins to carry names and titles, the identities of officials, the designations of offices, the labels of institutions and gods, and eventually, much later, but along the same steady path, it becomes capable of literature. That transformation does not happen overnight. It is the work of generations of scribes, each pushing the system slightly farther, each discovering that if you can record goods, you can also record people. If you can record people, you can record deeds. If you can record deeds, you can record stories. But in this small room, in this moment, the apprentice is still close to the beginning. Their tablet is not a poem, it is a list. The signs on it might represent grain deliveries, labour assignments, or allocations of food and drink. These are the kinds of documents archaeologists call Proto-Cuneiform tablets. Uruk period administrative lists with numerical notations, preserved when buildings collapsed or archives were abandoned, later found and studied with patient care. These tablets are among the most important artifact anchors we have for the birth of writing. Not because they are emotionally stirring in themselves, but because they show a system forming, an early habit of turning the world into marks, and that habit changes everything. Because once the world can be turned into marks, it can be managed at a distance, it can be reviewed later, it can be compared, it can be used to hold someone accountable who is not present in the room, it can outlast the speaker, it can outlast the listener. The apprentice sets the stylus down for a moment and flexes their hand, fingers stiff, wrists sore, the clay still damp enough for correction, if needed. The older scribe may nod, or may simply point to the next line. Outside, the city continues. People drink beer, workers sleep, night watchmen listen. Canals carry water through the darkness, steady and indifferent. Inside, marks are pressed into clay, quiet wedges that hold a fragment of the city's life. And the question that lingers is not loud. It is the kind of question that follows you out of the room and stays with you in the street and drifts into your thoughts as you lie down at night. If you can press a thought into clay, what parts of a life become worth recording and what is left unmarked? Dusk settles over the city in a slow, copper-coloured fade. The heat of the day loosens its grip and the air becomes easier to breathe. Shadows lengthen along the walls. In the streets, voices lower. Torches begin to appear, one here, one there, until courtyards and narrow lanes hold a scattered constellation of human-made light. Then the drums begin. Not a fast, excited rhythm, but a low, steady beat that seems to rise from the ground itself. It travels through brick and reed and bone. It gathers people without needing to call their names. They step out of doorways, out of alleys, out from the edge of the temple precinct, and they stand shoulder to shoulder, quietly attentive. A procession moves through the dusk. Ahead of it, a standard lifts above the crowd, steady in practiced hands. In torchlight, it looks almost like a small star that has descended into the street. Something bright and symbolic that can be seen from far away even when faces are lost in shadow. Now the landscape begins to separate into names, not just the south, not just the plain, but cities with their own pride, each one gathering itself tighter as if it can feel its neighbours watching. Walls matter more. Canals feel like lifelines. Fields begin to look less like open space and more like a boundary someone will argue over, defend, and remember. In the surviving record, each city gathers around a patron god and a temple household, an institution that stores grain, organizes labor, and holds the city's identity like a spine. The temple still anchors work, ritual, storage, and belonging. But the city now speaks of itself as a separate being, this place under this god, with these obligations, bounded by watercourses and ditches and lines in the earth that people learn to treat as if they were part of the body. And in that world, the idea of the king steps forward. By the time the earliest monuments and administrative texts begin to multiply, the figure of the ruler is harder to miss. Titles shift from city to city, lugal, ainsi, and the balance between priest and commander is never perfectly stable. But the outline is there. Certain individuals become publicly associated with command, with decision, with the power to direct labor and to claim victories that a whole city is meant to share. Power begins to take a human face, but once power has a face, it can be blamed, and it can be remembered. Still, it would be a mistake to imagine early kingship as one fixed thing, a single clean shape that appears and remains unchanged. Some historians argue that early rulers could be temple administrators in one setting, war leaders in another, and sacred mediators in yet another. Men who stood, in ritual and in politics, between the city and its god. In truth, the role may have shifted with circumstance, and with the needs of a place whose life depended on water, grain, and fragile agreement. In a city where the temple is the heart, rulership cannot ignore ritual. In a landscape where water is life, rulership cannot ignore canals. In a world of nearby rivals, rulership cannot ignore the possibility of violence. So the figure near the center of the procession may be many things to many people. To some, the ruler is the organizer, the one who can coordinate repairs when floodwater breaks a canal bank, the one who can direct workers to rebuild a wall, the one who can settle disputes when households argue over land. To others, the ruler is the protector, the one who gathers men when boundary tensions flare, the one who sends messengers to negotiate, the one who can claim strength on behalf of the city. And to others still, the ruler is the representative, the one whose offerings and formal words matter because they are performed for the city, the one who can stand before the god's image and ask, with careful phrases for favor. All of this grows heavier as competition over land and water begins to define relationships between neighboring cities. This is not an endless open field where everyone can simply expand. It is a managed landscape. Fields depend on canals, canals depend on maintenance, and maintenance depends on cooperation or coercion. When one city changes an intake, another city's crops may suffer. When boundaries are disputed, it is not abstract territory at stake, but the difference between a full granary and a thin season. So city-states watch each other. They count. They remember old agreements. They argue over markers and ditches, over the quiet, precise line where one set of obligations ends and another begins. And inside the city, while gods and standards rise in the dusk, ordinary life continues in measured portions. A temple worker waits in line. The air smells faintly of oil and wet clay, and the line barely moves. Not in a dramatic way, not like a scene meant to be remembered, but in the patient way people wait when they have waited all their lives. The temple household distributes rations, and the worker receives what has been allotted: grain, oil, perhaps wool, depending on status, role, and the needs of the institution. These rations come in standardized portions, a kind of survival measured in repeatable units. The worker may carry them home to a family, or consume part of it on the spot. Either way, the ration is not only food, it is a sign of belonging and also of dependence. It says, your labor is counted, and so your life is fed. If you want to touch something solid in this world, it is here. In ceilings pressed into wet clay, in short inscriptions cut into stone or written, on vessels in ration records that repeat the same measures until the measures begin to feel like fate. Later compilations, like the Sumerian King List, also speak of this world, but at a distance. They are useful, and they are complex, shaped by later perspectives, sometimes clearer about ideals than about exact sequence. They help reveal how later Mesopotamians imagined legitimacy and continuity, how kingship was thought to move from city to city like a sacred inheritance. But they are not simple ledgers of events, and they must be handled with care. Taken together, inscriptions, ceilings, building remains, ration records, the pattern becomes clearer. The city is no longer only a cluster of homes around a temple. It is a political being, with a god, with boundaries, and with leaders whose authority can be seen, pressed, named. The procession moves on, the drums continue, low and steady. The standard sways slightly above the crowd, held upright against the evening breeze. Torches flicker on faces that are mostly unreadable in the half-light. Somewhere, the temple worker shifts the weight of grain in their arms and turns toward home. Somewhere, a scribe presses a seal into clay to close a storeroom door. Somewhere beyond the walls, canal water slides past reeds in the dark, indifferent to titles. And the thought that follows the procession is quiet, but it stays. When a city says its god chose a king, who is being convinced, the heavens or the people? Night wind moves over canal water. In the darkness it looks black, almost heavy, as if the river has thickened into something slower than water. The surface slides along without sparkle, without hurry. It carries the scent of silt, earth turned fine and soft by endless movement. And beneath that there is something faintly metallic, a sharpness that reminds you the water has travelled through mineral ground, through mud and reeds, through a world that is never entirely clean. If you listen closely, you can hear it. Not the loud rush of mountain rivers, but a low, steady sound. Water rubbing against the canal banks, slipping past clumps of reeds, touching the edges of the built world. In a land like this, the canals are not scenery. They are the bloodstream. They are the difference between full fields and empty ones. At the base of Sumer's wealth is irrigation. Without these channels, without water pushed and persuaded into fields that rain alone could never keep alive, there is no reliable surplus, no dense city life, no storerooms heavy with grain. But the bargain is constant work, the kind that never fully ends. A canal is not something you dig once and then forget. It silts up, the edges slump, reeds invade, water finds new routes, cutting where it wants, stealing flow away from fields that depend on it. Every season brings small emergencies. Every year brings wear that shows itself in the simplest measurements. Grain yields rising or falling, rations feeling plentiful or thin. So the city depends not only on builders and scribes and priests and rulers. It depends on people whose work is quieter, dirtier, and less likely to be remembered by name. A canal cleaner is awake before dawn. They wade knee-deep into mud. The water is cold at first, then numbing. The canal bed grips their legs as if trying to keep them there. Reeds scratch and bend. Insects hum in the dark. In their hands is a simple tool, something like a hooked stick or a blade used to pull, away choking growth, to break up clumps of silt, to clear the channel so the water can move. Timing is everything. A delay of hours can mean seedlings scorched by noon heat, a field that drinks too late, a household that feels the shortage weeks later. Water must reach the furrows before the sun climbs high and begins pulling moisture back into the sky, before young plants wilt, before a small problem becomes a season's loss. The canal cleaner might not speak much while working. Breath is used for effort. The mind is used for focus. Where to pull, where to dig, where to brace. And yet, in that repetitive, heavy labour, the shape of the whole civilization is present. The city's wealth is not only in temples and palaces, but in these muddy mornings. When the canal is cleared, water flows where it should, and the city breathes more easily. But that breath is always measured, not just by rainfall or heat, but by human systems, by institutions that decide who works, who eats, and how much. In the early dynastic world, land, labour and rations are organised through large households, temple households and palace households, centres that are sacred and practical at the same time. The temple is holy, and it is administrative. The palace is political, and it is logistical. Between them, fields are assigned, harvests are gathered, labour is mobilised and rations are distributed. Grain, oil, wool, sometimes beer, portion by portion, mark by mark. Households vary widely in status. Some live with comfort, grain stored in quantity, textiles in abundance, dependents and workers attached to their roof. Others live close to the line, where a late delivery or a bad season presses hard. And there are people whose lives are not their own in the way we like to imagine a life. Dependent labourers and enslaved people, appearing in records as managed resources counted, alongside animals and tools. What the tablets show again and again is deepening stratification. Elite households with land and influence, others bound to institutions through obligation, debt, or force. The details can be painful to sit with, because the tablets often speak in the language of administration, not in the language of emotion. A person can appear as a line item, as a worker assigned, as a dependent counted. It is one of the quiet truths of early states. The ability to feed many people is linked to the ability to command many people, and even within these institutions the balance shifts. Historians still debate how to understand the relationship between the so-called temple economy and palace economy. The evidence suggests it changes across time and from city to city. In some places, temples seem to dominate as economic centres. In others, palaces rise in prominence. Often the lines blur because elites move between these worlds and institutions share personnel, resources and authority. The ancient world didn't label itself neatly. It simply functioned. A worker receives rations, a supervisor counts deliveries, a scribe records allocations, a temple ritual marks a season, a palace messenger carries orders. All of it together keeps the irrigation machine running, and that machine has a feeling to it if you live inside it. It is not always hunger in the dramatic sense of famine. Often it is quieter. It is the knowledge that the margin is thin, that a household's well-being depends on water flow and institutional schedules, that your portion can be reduced, that your labour can be demanded. Quiet hunger is not only an empty stomach, it is a kind of attention, a way of watching measures, watching jars, watching the faces of those who distribute. In the ration line, no one argues loudly. They watch the bowl. They watch the level of grain inside it. They watch whether the scribe's stylus pauses, whether the mark is clean, or whether it hesitates, as if deciding what a person is worth today. In this world, the tablets become louder. City archives preserve the rhythm of the system in ration lists and labour rosters, who received grain, who received oil, who was assigned to which task, how many days of work were counted. They can look repetitive, almost dull, until you realise that each line represents a human day. A day spent digging, a day spent carrying bricks, a day spent weaving, a day spent wading in mud. The archive does not tell you what someone thought while doing that work. It does not tell you what songs they hummed or what worries they carried home, but it tells you they existed. It tells you their labour mattered enough to be recorded. and that the institutions were deeply invested in knowing precisely where their resources went. Nightwind continues over the canal. The water keeps sliding southward, carrying silt, carrying the city's future in every slow, steady movement. In the dark, you can almost imagine the canal as a living thing, fed, cleaned, watched, and sometimes neglected, with consequences that ripple outward. Somewhere a canal cleaner finishes the last pull of reeds and steps out, legs heavy with mud. Somewhere a supervisor locks a storeroom. Somewhere a scribe sets a tablet down to dry, knowing tomorrow will bring more lists, more counts, more names. And once you begin to see the canal as more than water, as a kind of government made of flow and labour, your attention starts to drift toward the people who claim to speak for it, the ones who stood closest to the storehouses, the ones whose voices carried inside temples, and through it all the question remains, quiet, patient, like water that never stops moving. How many hands does it take to keep a river from becoming either a blessing or a slow disaster? A silent plain lies under starlight. The earth is low and open, and the night air carries the faint smell of wet clay drying. In the dark, shields are stacked in small heaps. Their rounded backs catch a little moonlight, so they look almost alive, like sleeping animals settled into the dust. Nearby, spears lean together in quiet bundles, their tips hidden. Somewhere beyond the camp, reeds whisper against one another. A commander moves among the men and speaks in whispers so soft the words seem to vanish before they fully exist. In this world, war does not always begin with shouting. Sometimes it begins with a boundary ditch dug in the wrong place, a canal diverted just a little too far, a field claimed by one city's surveyors and rejected by another's. In southern Mesopotamia, where water can mean survival, the shape of a channel can decide which village eats and which goes hungry. And so, rival city-states, Lagash and Umma among the most famous, find themselves drawn into cycles of conflict over land, canals, and the thin lines that separate ours from theirs. These are not vast empires clashing across continents. They are neighbours, close enough that the same wind can cross both their fields in a single hour. They trade, they watch each other, they marry and bargain and argue, and then, when the balance breaks, they fight. Their armies move over familiar ground. Men step into mud that still holds the marks of last season's harvest. The land itself becomes a ledger, and each city tries to press its name more deeply into it. Sometimes the argument ends not with a speech, but with a stone marker pushed into the soil, quiet, heavy, and meant to outlast the men who placed it. Warfare here is tied to the economy, and just as tightly to ritual. A victory is not only a change in who controls a strip of earth, it is a statement about the favour of a patron deity. Cities understand themselves through their gods, and conflict becomes something larger than the men carrying spears. When a ruler claims success, he does not present it as mere strength of arms. He presents it as the will of the city god, an invisible decision made in the divine realm, expressed through dust and blood. So, after the fighting, the story is carried into temples and set down in inscriptions. Offerings are made, dedicatory words are arranged with care. A battle becomes a sacred event as well as a political one. The enemy is not simply another city. The enemy is the rival god's household, the rival god's people, the rival god's claim to order. Out of these struggles come boundary inscriptions, dry, practical lines about where a ditch should run, which canal feeds which fields, and what happens when a promise is broken. It is an early attempt to do something fragile, to make the landscape behave, not only through force, but through words. These texts do not just remember violence, they reach toward a future where the same dispute might be settled before men lift their shields by fixing the landscape into language. And yet, even as they preserve events, these inscriptions also shape them. Read closely and you can feel the hand behind the stone. A ruler does not carve doubt into a monument. He carves certainty. He tells the story in a way that makes his actions look rightful, his enemy reckless, his victory inevitable. He may pass over defeats. He may sharpen the punishments. He may present a tangled dispute as if it were simple, a boundary kept versus a boundary violated. The famous Stele of the Vultures, associated with Lagash, stands as one of the clearest examples of this kind of commemorative authority. It does not merely report a conflict, it shows it. It frames war in images and symbols, discipline, dominance, divine sanction. It is a monument that turns a battle into a lesson. It tells those who see it, this is what happens when boundaries are crossed. This is what the city god does through his chosen ruler. This is how power should look when it wants to be remembered. But below these carved messages, beneath the lofty language of kings and temples, there are ordinary bodies standing in the cold hours before dawn. A foot soldier waits with a ration loaf wrapped in cloth and a water skin slung across his shoulder. The bread is dense and dry. It is meant to last. The water is precious. In his mind, glory is not the first thought. Thirst is, the sharp ache of hunger after a long day, the fear of heat rising when the sun comes. He thinks of his feet sinking into mud and of the weight of a shield pressing his arm numb. He thinks of home as a place of routine, not romance, a place where life is measured by meals and the turning of seasons. He knows, perhaps, that if they win, the priest will offer thanks. The ruler will proclaim the city's god triumphant. The boundary stones will be set. The canal will be opened or closed according to the new claim. And then the men will go back to their fields, if they still have fields to return to. If they are still alive, to hold a plough. In this way, war becomes another kind of labour in the Sumerian world, hard, organised and deeply connected to the same irrigation system that sustains everything else. To fight for land is to fight for grain. To fight for canals is to fight for the right to drink, to plant, to endure. The battlefield is never entirely separate from the farm. The same hands that carry weapons will soon carry baskets of earth, lifting silt out of channels, restoring the flow of water so life can continue. And when it is over, when the dead are gathered, when the tools are put down, when the last shouts fade into the open sky, the land may look almost unchanged. A field is still a field. A canal still reflects the sun. The reeds still grow back. Only the people feel the difference. And that leaves a quiet question hanging in the night air, like breath that never fully settles. When a battle ends, does the land remember, or is it only the people, returning to the canal, who carry the change? Lamplight glints on gold in a deep pit. Down there the air would have been cooler, close, stale and heavy, the way it gets when earth holds it in. The walls of the grave shaft would have risen like a narrow canyon of packed soil. In the light of oil lamps, metal would have answered with a soft, steady shine. Gold catching every movement, every breath. For a moment it is easy to imagine music, even though only earth remains now. As if the last note had nowhere to go and simply stayed in the ground. At one of the great cities of southern Mesopotamia, archaeologists uncovered what we now call the Royal Cemetery. It is not a single tomb, but a landscape of burials, some modest, some astonishingly rich. And among them are graves that speak unmistakably of elite status, deep shafts, carefully arranged bodies, and grave goods that were not meant for daily use. These were objects meant for the border between life and death, meant to accompany someone into whatever lay beyond. The established fact is simple and heavy. The royal cemetery reveals elaborate funerary rituals and an extraordinary concentration of wealth placed into the ground. Someone, many someones, chose to gather costly materials, skilled labour and time, and then to bury it all. Not as hidden treasure to be recovered later, but as a final offering. A sentence written without ink, only wait. When you look at the materials found there, you can feel the reach of the Sumerian world. Lapis lazuli, deep blue as night water, does not come from the alluvial plains. Carnelian, warm and reddish, also arrives from far away. Gold, too, is not native to the southern marshlands. These items point beyond the rivers, beyond the mud brick walls, beyond the horizon, toward mountains and deserts and distant routes where goods changed hands many times before they reached. And in a city built of mud brick and reeds, that imported bluestone must have looked almost unreal. This is not an abstract idea of trade. It is a chain of human effort. Someone mined stone in place of hard rock and thin air. Someone carried it down into lower lands. Someone loaded it onto animals, or onto boats, or onto backs. Someone negotiated, exchanged, and risked loss. The royal cemetery holds the end of those journeys, a final stop where the world's distance became visible as beauty. And if so much could be carried in from far away, it leaves a quieter question behind. What, exactly, was sending back out into the world? And beauty is everywhere in these burials. Art objects depict banquet scenes, animals and mythic imagery, windows into status and symbolism. The motifs don't give us a clean translation. They give us a world view, status, story, and the sacred pressed into the same image. In broad, steady terms, the objects suggest a world where feasting matters, where animals carry symbolic weight, where the boundary between human life and sacred story is not sharply drawn. There are instruments too, lyres and other items associated with sound. We cannot truly hear what they once sounded like in the ceremonies of not with certainty. But we can acknowledge a simple human fact. Funerals in many cultures are not only quiet, they are also filled with music, with rhythm, with the attempt to shape grief into something bearable. It is a human impulse to supply the missing sound, to imagine songs echoing off mud brick walls, drifting over the river in the night. But the evidence leaves us with instruments, not the songs themselves. Among the most difficult and ethically sensitive aspects of the royal cemetery are the burials that include multiple bodies arranged together, what are sometimes called retainers. Here, interpretation is unavoidable, and it must be handled with care. Some scholars suggest these individuals may have been sacrificed as part of a funerary rite. Others caution that we may be seeing obligation, coercion, or a ritual logic that refuses modern labels. The archaeological record shows arrangements, positions, and contexts, but it does not provide a clear, unanimous explanation of intent. Whatever the reality, it reminds us of something uncomfortable and enduring. Elite splendor often rests on lives that are quieter, more vulnerable, and less recorded. Even in the richest graves, the dead do not bury themselves. Someone organized these ceremonies. Someone prepared the bodies. Someone placed the objects in deliberate order. Someone decided what a ruler or a high-status figure should take into the earth. And someone made the objects themselves. Imagine an artisan in long before the burial, in a workshop where the light arrives in a narrow slice and then moves on. The air smells of smoke from a small fire, and the tang of bitumen used to seal and bind. In his hands is a tiny piece of stone. It may be hard, resistant, unwilling. He holds it steady and drills, using a simple tool, grit, patience. He drills again, hour after hour. The work is slow, because the bead is small, and a single slip can ruin it. He does not drill because he loves the stone. He drills because the bead will become a message. Strung together, bead after bead, it will form a necklace that says something without words. Rank, wealth, connection to distant places, closeness to power. It will sit against someone's skin in life, and then perhaps it will lie against their bones in death. The artisan may never enter the palace, he may never speak to the person who wears it, but his hands will have shaped how that person appears to the world. This is one of the quiet truths the royal cemetery reveals. These graves are not only about the dead, they're about the living structure of society, who commands labour, who receives luxury, who is remembered through objects, and who remains unnamed. Today, the finds from the royal cemetery, lyres, inlays, jewellery and more, are held in museum collections and preserved in excavation records. They are photographed, catalogued and compared. They travel in exhibitions. They sit behind glass. They are treated as art, as evidence, as treasure. But they were once something else, something intimate. Objects placed close to a body, chosen for a reason, surrounded by the heat and breath of a living city. And even with all their splendour, they point toward a silence that no wealth can avoid. In the end, every burial, royal or humble, becomes earth. The lamps go out, the music ends, the city continues for a time without the one it buried. So the chapter closes with a question that is soft but persistent. It rises from the grave pits of Ur the way lamplight once did, briefly and then gone. What does a civilization choose to carry into the earth with its dead? And what does that choice say about the living? A messenger runs at twilight along a road of packed earth. His sandals strike the ground with a steady, urgent rhythm. Each step kicks up dust, and the dust rises behind him like a second body. Pale, drifting, unwilling to fall back to silence. The light is fading. The horizon is a thin line of darkening blue. Somewhere ahead there will be a gate, a guard, a brief question asked in a low voice. And then the message will move again, carried onward into another city's night. In the centuries of Sumerian city-states, power has usually been local. It has had the shape of a temple precinct, a palace courtyard, a wall that can be walked in an hour. Authority has been something you can see. The ziggurat rising above roofs, the ruler's standard lifting above a procession, the canal that proves who commands labour. But now a new shape begins to take form, longer, wider, less easy to hold in the mind. Sargon of Akkad, according to later accounts and surviving inscriptions, builds an empire that draws the Sumerian city-states into a broader imperial order. However we picture it, the outcome is clear enough in the record's outline. The old map of rival, mostly independent cities is altered. A larger authority claims them, not one city god's household competing with another, but a centralized power reaching across many. It is difficult from this distance to know exactly how it felt while it was still becoming real. Archaeology gives us layers, texts give us official voices, and between those two, human experience remains partly hidden. Still, certain patterns come into view. Storehouses begin to feel farther away than their walls suggest. Barley, wool, and sealed jars of oil travel under impressions pressed into clay. New men appear near gates, quiet, watchful, not from the neighbourhood, and suddenly the city's old arguments have an extra listener, someone who reports to a centre the locals will never see. The messenger on the road is one small sign of it, because an empire is not only made by conquest, it is made by messages that arrive on time. Administration changes too, but not in the simple way of replacement. Akkadian and Sumerian coexist. The established evidence suggests a blending in culture and governance rather than one world simply wiping out the other. Sumerian, already tied to temple life and scribal schools, continues in the hands of trained writers. Akkadian, closely related but distinct, moves through the same channels of power. Names are pressed differently, titles shift, but the clay tablets still multiply. The wheel of record-keeping keeps turning, now under a larger hand. This is how empire enters a life that still looks ordinary from the street. A new seal on an old door, a new weight standard on a familiar scale, a new line on a tablet that turns what we owe into what we must deliver. Not always first as soldiers, but as expectations. What must be counted, what must be reported, what must arrive before the next accounting day. A tax that once went to a local temple storehouse may now be assessed in relation to a wider system. A local ruler may find his position redefined, watched more closely, or replaced. Decisions begin to flow from farther away, and yet interpretation matters here. Some historians suggest the reach of imperial control likely varied by region and by year. Empire can be both structure and aspiration. In one city it may be tight, officials present, direct oversight, a garrison close enough to be felt. In another it may be lighter, more like influence than grip, more like a claim than a daily presence. Distance creates gaps. Roads wash out. Governors grow ambitious. So it is reasonable to imagine that Akkad was not experienced the same way in every courtyard or in every season. Still, the idea of empire changes the atmosphere of the world. It changes what people think is possible. It changes the horizon of fear and ambition. In a city-state world, the greatest threat is often the neighbour. In an imperial world, the centre becomes a constant presence, even if unseen, like a shadow cast over many different courtyards. In a quiet room lined with tablets, a bilingual scribe sits with a stylus in hand. The clay beneath his fingers is damp and cool. The surface is smooth at first, like unspoken thought. He presses in signs, first in one tongue, then in another. Names, quantities, goods, a list of deliveries, a record of tribute, a roster, a receipt. He learns, line by line, that power can arrive as language. He must be careful. A single sign can alter a meaning. A single number can change an obligation. And now the stakes feel broader. These tablets may travel. They may be checked by someone outside the city. They may become evidence in a dispute between local officials and imperial administrators. The scribe's work is not merely clerical. It is political, whether he wants it to be or not. The artifact anchor for this chapter lies in Akkadian royal inscriptions and the administrative tablets that reflect imperial governance. Royal inscriptions speak in the voice of authority. They tell of victories, of control, of the ruler's reach. They are meant to be remembered. They are meant to shape how history is seen. Like earlier city-state inscriptions, they are both record and statement, showing us how the empire wished to be understood, powerful, rightful, enduring. But in the quieter tablets, the ration lists, the receipts, the rosters, we see the empire as routine, wool weighed, barley measured, workdays tallied. The imperial world is built out of small acts repeated until they feel like weather. Conquest opens the door, but administration keeps the house standing. And somewhere, the messenger keeps running. He moves between cities that once faced each other as rivals and now face the same distant centre. His breath comes hard in the cooling air. The dust behind him settles slowly as if reluctant to let go. He does not know, cannot know, how later centuries will name this moment. The first empire, a turning point, a new era. For him it is simply a road, a message, the knowledge that he must arrive. And so the chapter ends with a quiet question that lingers like twilight itself. When authority stretches farther than any one city, does it create peace, or only a larger arena for fear? And somewhere beyond the last gate, beyond the last torch, another message is already being written. A dry wind moves over cracked canal beds. The water is pulled back into thinner channels, leaving edges that flake and crumble underfoot. In places where boats once slid through reeds, there is only hard mud, broken into plates like old pottery. The night sky above is sharp with stars, too sharp almost, like a sky that has no moisture left to give. The air tastes faintly of dust. Even the silence feels brittle. Empires, when they rise, can seem inevitable. They gather cities into their orbit. They draw tribute along roads. They stamp their names onto tablets and monuments. But empires also depend on countless fragile things. Harvests arriving on time, governors remaining loyal, soldiers being fed, canals holding their shape. When those supports weaken, when distance grows heavier than authority, an imperial structure does not always collapse in one sound. Often it simply begins to loosen. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, the Akkadian order starts to thin, still present in titles and in administrative habits, but less certain on the ground. Later voices describe turmoil and changing control in Sumer, a time remembered as disruption, confusion, and loss. Much of what we hear comes from people writing afterward, people with reasons to frame the past as darkness. Even so, the record keeps the same feeling. The old grip falters, and the region enters a period that seems, from the inside, unsteady. It is tempting to imagine collapse as a single dramatic moment, one decisive battle, one final king, one day when the gates never opened again. But history rarely breaks so neatly. More often it frays. Power slips, then returns, then slips again. One city may hold steady while another struggles. One region may face hunger while another manages. And even in crisis, daily life continues because people continue. Some historians point to climate stress as one thread in this unravelling, often linked to what is called the 4.2K event, a period associated in some scientific studies with increased aridity in parts of the ancient Near East. It remains debated, and it should not be treated as a single master key. Not a sudden apocalypse, more like a slow tightening year by year, as if the sky had learned to hold back. In a world dependent on canals and crops, even modest shifts in rainfall, river behaviour, or agricultural reliability could amplify pressures that were already there. Political strain, contested loyalty, the cost of feeding armies, the fragility of distance. And once that trust breaks, even slightly, how do you measure a year? And then there are the Gutians. In later memory, their name arrives like a cold step on a stair, a word used to explain why the market felt tense, why the road felt unsafe, why the temple lists no longer matched the granary. Some sources portray Gutian rule as destabilizing, outsiders associated with disorder, as if the very mention of them is meant to explain why the world felt wrong. But those portrayals are shaped by the politics of restoration. When a new dynasty claims to mend what was broken, it benefits from describing what came before as chaos. It makes recovery feel heroic. It makes legitimacy feel earned. So while it is established that the Gutians appear in the historical tradition tied to this period of shifting control, the way they are described must be read carefully, as much a mirror of later storytelling as a neutral report. What can be said more steadily is that city life continues in altered forms. Administration persists, temples remain, local rulers still appear, even uncertainty has its routines. Grain is still counted, even if there is less of it. Labour is still organised, even if the work is harder. Prayers are still spoken, perhaps with more urgency now, perhaps with older confidence shaken but not gone. In the fields beyond a city wall, a farmer watches the canal. He knows the canal not only as water but as time. The season is marked by its rise and fall, by the day the flow becomes strong enough to flood a field, by the day it drops low and exposes the mud. In a stable year, the canal is a promise that repeats itself. In an unsteady year, it becomes a question. He stands with his hands on his hips, feeling the wind dry the sweat on his skin. He watches overseers measure allocations. He watches neighbours glance sideways, calculating who will receive water first, who will have to wait, who will lose a crop if the flow thins further, and he learns, slowly, bitterly, that a canal is also a kind of calendar, a promise measured in hours of water. When water shrinks, everything else shifts with it. Work becomes more frantic. Maintenance becomes harder because the mud dries into something stubborn. Arguments over boundaries sharpen because the margin between survival and hunger narrows. And if central authority is weakening, fear grows heavier. Who will enforce agreements now? Who will punish theft? Who will keep the canal cleared when labourers are exhausted and rations are thin? The traces of this period come through later historical inscriptions and through city archives that reflect disruption and restoration. Many of those inscriptions speak from the viewpoint of those who survived and rebuilt, those who needed the past to look broken in order for the present to look legitimate. Even so, they reveal something important. People experience this time as a break in order, as a period that required repair, explanation, and renewed confidence. Restoration narratives carry a certain tone, a promise that the world can be made whole again, that the gods have returned their favour, that the canals will run as they should, that boundaries will be respected. That tone itself tells us what was feared, a world where the flow could not be trusted, where authority could not reach, where the old rhythms failed. And yet, even in a world unsteady, the most stubborn thing is habit. A hearth still burns when there is fuel. Grain is ground when there is grain. Bread is shared, sometimes smaller than before, sometimes offered anyway. Nets are mended. Mats are woven. Offerings are carried to temples, perhaps with trembling hands, perhaps with quiet anger, perhaps with a hope that feels thin but refuses to die. The walls of the cities may stand. The words on tablets may continue to be pressed into clay. But the centre of life is often something simpler. The routines of ordinary meals, the daily agreements between neighbours, the quiet labour that keeps a household breathing. So the chapter closes with a question that rests gently, like dust settling after wind. When the old order breaks, what survives first? The walls, the words, or the routines of ordinary meals? A lamp burns low in an archive room. Its flame is small and steady, fed carefully so it does not gutter. The light falls on clay, on tablets stacked in neat piles, their edges worn by handling, their surfaces marked with dense lines of wedges. In the dimness, they resemble loaves of bread lined up on shelves. Each one is heavy in the hand. Each one holds a day preserved. Outside, the city sleeps in layers, courtyards, alleyways, rooftops where night air settles like cloth. But in this room, time does not drift. Time is filed. After the unsteady years that followed the fall of Akkadian power, the south gathers itself again. In the river cities, storehouses refill, offices reopen, temple courtyards return to routine. And in Ur, a new dynasty begins to draw the scattered pieces into one shape. The third dynasty of Ur, often called Ur III, reunifies much of southern Mesopotamia under a highly organized state. Order returns, not as a single dramatic moment but as a steady tightening. Rules that hold, roots that reopen, labour that is summoned and directed. The record of this change survives in an overwhelming way. Tablet after tablet, pressed and dried, a flood of documentation that modern scholars still work through by the tens of thousands. It is sometimes called a Sumerian Renaissance, not because the past is revived unchanged, but because certain older forms rise again with new confidence. Sumerian language in official life, temple tradition, and a style of statecraft that favours measurement and accountability. Becomes a centre again. Officials move through corridors with purpose. Brick is fired and stacked. Labour is assigned. The state becomes a rhythm, steady, insistent, built from rations, lists, and the quiet authority of numbers. And the sound of that rhythm, more than anything else, is writing. Administration becomes extraordinarily detailed. Taxation, labour, livestock, textiles, and shipments are tracked in massive bodies of tablets. This is not the birth of record-keeping. The tools had long existed, but now they expand in volume and precision as if the state has decided that the safest way to hold the world steady is to hold it on clay. A herd is counted by head and condition. A shipment is no longer just a boat leaving a dock, but a list of quantities, destinations and names, each one pressed into wet clay, then dried into permanence. Even the most ordinary motion through the city begins to cast a shadow in the archives, a second life made of wedges. The more you look at it, the more you sense a worldview at work. In Ur III, a state does not rule only through force or ceremony. It rules through organization, through predictable flows, grain from field to storehouse, wool from flock to workshop, finished textiles from workshop to distribution, through careful assignment of who owes what, who receives what, and who is accountable when something goes missing. And sometimes, between the clean lines of that system, you catch small hints of what refuses to stay clean. A delivery delayed, a name rewritten, a total corrected, a shortage explained and then explained again. Tiny fractures in the smooth surface, quiet reminders that people, unlike numbers, do not always move as expected. In the background, monumental building flourishes. Great projects rise from the earth, including famous ziggurat construction. These are not merely religious statements, they are demonstrations of capacity. They show that thousands of hands can be gathered and directed, that brick can be shaped into mountains of architecture, that a city can lift its sacred places into the sky. It is easy, when looking at a ziggurat, to think first of the gods. But it is also worth noticing the human reality beneath it, mixing clay, cutting straw, shaping bricks, drying them, hauling them, stacking them. Each brick is an act repeated. Each level is a season of work. Each rise in the structure is a rise in coordination, proof that the state can move people like water through a canal, guiding them into place. This is also a period when legal tradition becomes more visible in surviving texts. The Code of Ur-Nammu is often cited among the earliest known law code traditions, though what remains is partial. We should be cautious not to invent or embellish wording, but the very existence of such a text suggests a particular kind of ambition, the desire to present justice and order as something formal, stated, and repeatable. Another way, like administration, of making the world legible to power. Yet even in a system this organized, the state is still made of people. At dawn, before the heat grows heavy, a warehouse supervisor stands in a yard where wool bundles are stacked. The light is pale, the shadows are long, the smell is sharp, animal, earthy, slightly sour. He walks along the rows and counts, touching each bundle as if touch itself might guarantee accuracy. He has learned what a shortfall means. It is not merely a missing bundle. It is a question that lands on him like a hand closing around the throat. Where did it go? Who took it? Was it miscounted? Misrecorded? did it never arrive? The tablet will show what should be there. The official above him will show little patience for explanations. In this world, accountability is personal. The records are precise enough that an error is not always treated as natural human slip. It can be read as negligence, or theft, or disloyalty. The supervisor counts again. He counts slowly because speed is dangerous. His eyes move from bundle to bundle. His mind moves from number to number. Somewhere, a scribe will press these totals into clay, and the clay will remember long after the wool has been spun, woven, worn, and turned to dust. There is something almost haunting in this. The wool is soft and temporary. The tablet is hard and lasting. The living work disappears, but the record remains. If you want to touch the third, you do not reach first for a crown or a weapon. You reach for a tablet, small, dense, practical. The kind of object that once sat warm in a clerk's hands before it hardened into permanence. And beside that sea of paperwork stands another surviving sign of the age, the tradition represented by the Code of Ur-Nammu, where authority is not only enforced but also written down as an ideal. Together they leave us with a picture of a society where governance is deeply textual, where writing is not an occasional tool but a constant presence. Clay becomes a kind of second landscape layered over the real one, a landscape of accounts, obligations and names, and yet, as detailed as these records are, they are not everything. They're loud where the state is loud, taxation, labour, shipments, institution-managed production. They're quieter about private lives, about emotions, about the inner spaces of people who worked and waited and endured. We can see rations distributed, but not the taste of the food. We can see labour assigned, but not the thoughts carried in the labourer's mind. Some historians suggest that this is one of the central ironies of III. The more the state records, the more it reveals the state's priorities, and the more it leaves other things in shadow. A human being becomes visible as a worker, a recipient of rations, a name on a list. But their laughter, their grief, their small rebellions, their private hopes, those often remain unmarked. And still, people lived within it. They found ways to breathe within the ledger. They loved, argued, prayed, and slept. They endured the weight of organization and perhaps sometimes found comfort in its predictability, because predictability after chaos can feel like mercy. In the archive room, the lamp burns lower. A scribe's hand pauses above a tablet. The warehouse supervisor's count becomes a line of wedges. A day becomes an object. A life becomes a record. And that leaves a soft question lingering, like the last warmth of the lamp in the dark. If a state can record nearly everything, where does a human being go to feel uncounted? Incense smoke curls into darkness. It rises in pale threads, slow and patient, as if it has all the time in the world. The night air holds it close, letting it drift across a temple courtyard where stone and brick have cooled after the day's heat. Lamps burn in sheltered corners. Shadows gather beneath columns and along the edges of walls. Somewhere within the precinct, a singer's voice begins, soft at first, almost like another kind of smoke, then steadier, shaping the silence into something held. In the world of Sumer, temples are not only places of prayer, they are where a city gathers its meaning. Ritual happens here, yes, but so do lessons and ledgers and the slow work of keeping memory from slipping away. Grain is counted, offerings are recorded, apprentices learn to read, and over time, another kind of text grows more visible in the clay. Hymns, prayers, laments, words made for the gods and for the people who must live beneath them. We can see that growth in the compositions that survived, and in the school traditions that kept copying them long after the cities themselves began to change. To call these texts literature is accurate, but it can sound too clean. In their original setting, they were not only words on clay, they were voices. They were performed, sung or spoken with measured breath, inside spaces built to amplify reverence. A hymn was not simply read, it was enacted in sound, with pauses that mattered, with repetition that carried weight, with a cadence that could settle a crowd into shared attention. And somewhere along the long arc of early writing, something shifts, quietly, almost without announcement. The oldest tablets had counted grain and labour. They had tracked the movement of goods through storehouses. But here, alongside those tallies, the clay begins to hold another kind of record, language used for praise, for grief, for devotion. Not only the economy of a city, but the inner life of it, at least the inner life shaped in ritual under lamplight, among stone and smoke. Within this tradition, one name stands out across the distance of millennia, Enheduanna. Later copies remember her as an en-priestess at Ur, serving Nana, the moon god, and tradition also calls her a daughter of Sargon of Akkad, someone standing at a meeting point where temple and empire could not be fully separated. She's often cited as the earliest known named author in world literature, because her name is attached to hymns and compositions preserved through scribal transmission. That attachment alone is striking. Much of the ancient world speaks to us anonymously, through lists and inscriptions and works whose creators remain unseen. But here, memory keeps a figure, not through a conquest boast or a statue base, but through sacred language. Still, we should say this softly. The tablets we read today are not untouched manuscripts from her own hands. They are copies, sometimes made centuries later, by students and scribes who inherited a tradition and repeated it with care. How much of what survives preserves her original voice, and how much is the school tradition speaking through the authority of her name, is debated. So when we say Enheduanna, we stand in a space where history and transmission overlap. Her name may mark an origin, a revered exemplar, a remembered composer, or more than one of these at once. Even with that caution, something remains quietly powerful. The idea of a woman's voice enduring through the long chain of clay and copying, a presence held not in stone monuments, not in territorial claims, but in hymns, language shaped toward what could not be seen. Temples are cultural engines in this sense. They do not only keep the gods pleased, they keep the city's words alive. They train the people who can read and write. They preserve texts that become canonical, repeated until their phrases feel older than the mouths that speak them. They tend memory the way a night watch tends a flame, shielding it from wind, feeding it, slowly, refusing to let it go out. In a corner of the courtyard, a novice singer stands with hands folded, listening. He is young, perhaps not only in years, but in status. He has not yet learned how to carry a hymn all the way through without strain. He learns by repetition. He hears the older singer's phrasing, then tries it himself, again and again. The words must be remembered, yes, but so must the pacing, the precise place to breathe, the pause that gives meaning, the slight rise in tone that signals reverence, the soft fall that signals sorrow. His feet rest on cooling brick. The scent of bitumen and incense clings to the air. The hymn is not only in his mind, it settles into his chest. And somewhere nearby, a scribe may sit with a tablet, making the hymn permanent in another way. The stylus presses wedges into clay, capturing not the sound itself, but the structure of sound, the sequence of words that can be brought back to life by another voice on another night, long after the first singer has fallen silent. This is what survives for us. Hymn tablets from temples, and later copies made in scribal schools, humble clay, dried and baked, sometimes broken, sometimes worn smooth by handling. and yet they carry an almost impossible cargo. Devotion, praise, lamentation, identity. They show that Sumer did not only build cities and count goods, it also built a world of language addressed to what cannot be measured. It is easy to forget how fragile that is. A tablet can crack, a library can burn, a city can fall, and yet the practice continues. Copies are made, students memorize, hymns travel from one generation to the next, from one city to another, from one era into another. Sometimes the words shift slightly, sometimes the framing changes, but the impulse remains to give the gods a voice and to give the human heart a form that can be spoken aloud. In the deep quiet of the temple precinct, the hymn ends. The incense still rises. The night air holds the last vibration of sound, then lets it fade. The stones return to their stillness, softened by what just passed through them, and that leaves an open, gentle question, one that lingers in the smoke and the dark. When a voice survives only as marks in clay, is it still a voice, or something even quieter? And if it can survive that way, through fire, through time, through the hands of strangers, then the next question is what else endured beside it, unnamed, waiting in the same silence. A ruined ziggurat stands under moonlight. Its terraces are broken now, the edges softened by time and weather. Bricks have slipped out of place and fallen, leaving gaps like missing teeth. Wind moves through those broken spaces and makes a faint, dry sound, like pages turning where no book remains. Above it, the moon lays a thin silver wash over the ruin, and for a moment it seems less like a fallen monument and more like a memory that refuses to fully disappear. Sumer does not vanish in a single moment. Power rarely changes that cleanly. The map rearranges itself slowly. New dynasties, new courts, new bargains struck in rooms where the old names still matter, but not in the same way. Amorite rulers rise. New centres gather people and wealth. The old city-states, Uruk, Lagash, do not disappear from the earth, but they no longer stand alone at the centre of their own world. They become part of something broader, more layered, less intimate, and in the midst of that political shift, something quieter happens, something you might miss unless you step back and listen across centuries. The Sumerian language gradually stops being spoken, not with a ceremony, not with a final sentence. It simply retreats from the places where language is born. Kitchens, courtyards, markets, the ordinary rooms where children learn their first words. Other tongues fill those spaces. The street changes its sound. The jokes change. The lullabies change. The old speech, once as natural as breathing, becomes something learned rather than lived. And yet Sumerian does not die the way a voice dies. It remains in the hands of scribes. It becomes a school language, a temple language, a formal inheritance. Not because people still speak it at home, but because people still copy it. And copying is never neutral. To copy is to declare what is worth carrying forward. It is devotion, yes, but it is also a kind of power. The past, preserved on purpose, becomes a tool the present can hold, because the written world of Mesopotamia does not end with Sumer. Cuneiform continues, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, many languages taking up the same wedge-shaped marks. The script becomes a bridge. It belongs to no single people for long. It becomes a shared instrument for lore and myth, for letters and accounts, for prayers and royal claims. So a story that began in one city's clay can travel far beyond that city's political life. Sumerian compositions can be translated, quoted, studied, and reshaped. Lists of words can be expanded into dictionaries. Hymns can be carried into other tongues, still keeping older rhythms beneath new phrasing. The wedges remain, and because they remain, The older world does not disappear completely. It lingers inside the newer one. In that way, Sumer itself begins to change meaning. It becomes more than a place on a map. It becomes a reference, an old foundation that later generations can point toward when they want legitimacy, depth, prestige. The name gains a kind of quiet weight, like an ancestor's house that no one lives in anymore but no one dares to forget. In a late scribal school, long after Sumerian has stopped being everyday speech, a student sits with a tablet. The room smells of damp clay and fine dust. Light falls in gently, through a doorway or a high opening in the wall, and catches on the wet surface of the tablet as he turns it slightly in his hands. His task is not to invent, it is to repeat. He copies an old Sumerian text the way someone might recite a prayer at the end of the day, line by line, sign by sign, letting the discipline of it settle his mind. He is learning a dead language to enter living institutions. He traces the signs carefully, because these are not just words. They are proof that he belongs to a chain, proof that he is trained, proof that he can carry the old forms without dropping them. In this setting, Sumerian is no longer the voice of the street. It is a high, formal voice, reserved, dignified, used when one wishes to draw on the authority of the past. And the tablets that show us this are often humble, almost intimate. School exercises, lexical lists, passages copied again and again until the wrist learns them. Some are uneven, some contain mistakes and corrections. You can sense the learner behind them, the hesitation of a line, the careful repair of a sign. They are not monuments, they are practice. And in that practice, Sumer survives. Beyond the schoolrooms, the larger archive grows. Temple collections, palace storerooms, libraries gathered and recopied by later scribes. Each tablet passes through many hands. The hand that wrote it, the hand that stored it, the hand that moved it, the hand that broke it by accident or preserved it by chance. And then, much later, the modern hand. Excavation and decipherment in the 19th and 20th centuries brought those marks back into human understanding. A tablet that lay buried under silt for thousands of years could be lifted into daylight, cleaned, studied, and read. A line of wedges, once pressed in an archive room by lamplight, could become intelligible again to someone sitting far away, in another century, in another language entirely. When that happens, something strange occurs. The past becomes present, not fully, not perfectly, but enough to change the shape of our beginnings. The cities may be ruined, the canals may have shifted, the fields may have been reworked by time, but the marks remain. And because they remain, the oldest world can still be approached, not as living speech, but as recoverable thought. It is tempting for a moment to imagine how many tablets are still down there, unbroken, unread, resting in sealed rooms where collapsed roofs preserved them, stories still sleeping in the dark. But even without that image, what we already have is astonishing. A civilization that outlived its own speech by becoming a discipline, a curriculum, an inheritance. The ruined ziggurat under moonlight feels in this chapter like the shape of that transformation. The building breaks, brick by brick. But the idea of the building, what it meant, what it represented, can persist in texts, in education, in the rituals later cultures choose to keep. In the scribal school, the student sets down his stylus. The tablet is still damp. The wedges are sharp. Tomorrow it will dry. Someday it may crack. Someday it may be buried again. But for now it holds a piece of Sumer, not as a spoken language in the street, but as a preserved inheritance, and that leaves a quiet question, lingering like the wind through broken brick. If a civilization stops speaking but keeps being copied, does it ever truly end? The rivers are there again at night. Dark water moves south in a slow, patient body, carrying silt from places where cities once breathed. The surface is almost black, but the moon lays a pale path across it, trembling whenever the current changes. Reeds whisper along the banks, bending and lifting as if they are speaking in a language older than walls. Somewhere far upstream, the land between the rivers holds its quiet layers: mud, ash, broken brick, forgotten courtyards, pressed together like pages that have been closed for a very long time. What Sumer leaves behind is not a single monument that stands forever. It is a set of habits that spread. The habit of gathering people into cities, close enough that their lives must be organized around one another. The habit of keeping the world legible, grain counted, work assigned, offerings measured, so that a crowded place can keep breathing from season to season. The habit of building a sacred centre that is also a storehouse. School, a heartbeat, and the habit of pressing words into clay, as if memory itself could be given weight. And yet what we know of Sumer is uneven, like light falling through broken roofing. The wealthy and the bureaucratic are loud. Their names are carved, their goods listed, their rituals preserved in careful copying. The poor and the private are faint. Their lives are often visible only as rations, as labour assignments, as anonymous hands moving through the machinery of temple and palace. The tablets speak, but they do not speak equally for everyone. It is easy to forget that, when we feel the pull of the grand story, cities rising, kings claiming, empires stretching, ziggurats lifting their stairways toward the sky. But the truth is quieter and more human. Most lives were not monuments. Most lives were mornings and evenings, bread and water, heat and dust, arguments and laughter that were never pressed into clay. So imagine an unnamed scribe at the end of a long day. He sits, where lamplight is weakest now, the wick burning down. His fingers are stiff from holding the stylus. His eyes ache from focusing on wedges and numbers. He looks at the tablet in front of him, still damp, still soft enough to smudge if touched carelessly, and he sets the stylus down. The work is done. It is only a record of deliveries, of rations, of some ordinary transaction that keeps the city running. He does not expect this tablet to outlive the city itself. He does not imagine centuries. He imagines sleep. He imagines tomorrow's tasks. He imagines the sound of water in canals, the call of birds at dawn, the pressure of work beginning again. The tablet is not made for immortality. It is made for accountability. And yet, in the long drift of time, a single clay tablet can end up in a museum drawer, catalogued, translated, retranslated, still holding a day's worth of ancient time. It becomes an unlikely bridge between a scribe who never expected to be remembered and a reader who leans close, trying to listen. There is one quiet kind of wonder that lingers at the river's edge. Somewhere beneath layers of silt, there may still be tablets unbroken, rooms sealed by collapse, archives sleeping in the dark, stories that could shift our sense of beginnings. We cannot say what they would reveal, but the possibility itself feels like a soft light under the earth, a reminder that the past is not finished with us. The river continues. It carries silt and memory together, without separating them, without judging which will last. It moves on through reeds and moonlight, past places where the first cities learned, briefly, to hold themselves together long enough to be heard across millennia. And if we listen closely, not for answers but for presence, what do we hear in those oldest marks? Perhaps not triumph, perhaps not instruction, perhaps only the steady proof that someone once sat by lamplight, pressed a stylus into wet clay, and, without meaning to, left a small human day behind,